Democracy is a sometimes difficult and frustrating way of doing things, but it's a foundational part of who we are as Unitarian Universalists. Our religious ancestors, at least on the Unitarian side of our family, came over to this land 400 years ago from England. Several substantive theological differences with the Church of England led them to break away and to create a new religion across the sea. But arguably, the most important difference that these so-called Puritans had with the Church of England was congregational polity. The Church of England, like the Roman Catholic Church it proceeded from, believed in a hierarchy with authority flowing downward through lines of apostolic succession. In contrast, in the tradition of the Free Church, of which our Puritan ancestors believed themselves to be a part, authority flowed upward from the people, from a gathering of congregants bound together by covenant, which meant the members of individual congregations each elected their own minister and their own lay leaders. This new form of congregational polity represented the most subversive kind of theology imaginable in the day, because it made a bold statement about who had the authority to both hear from and speak for God. Thus the birth of democracy in our church. It's a very American theology. This element of the Puritans' theology we UUs have retained to this day. It's one of the only elements of Puritan theology we have retained to this day. I often think if Jonathan Edwards could see us now, he'd be spinning in his grave. But over the past month, we have participated in a democratic exercise that has deep theological roots spanning hundreds of years. It was an exercise in democracy, but it was also an exercise of our very unique faith as UUs. There are many things I'd love to say right now in regards to the future ministry of this church, but at the moment, it is not yet ripe. It's a bit premature. I can tell you that I look forward to working with your democratically elected board to craft a ministerial contract in the coming days and weeks. And on a personal level, I would just like to say that me and my family are so grateful for all of you for embracing us as you have. Even to those who voted against the board proposal and spoke out against it, I want to thank you for the respectful tone you always maintained in these conversations. I know that that kind of respectful comportment flows from a deep love of this church and its members. And so for that, personally, I sincerely thank each and every one of you. Thank you. Now for the real sermon. We just talked a little bit about the history of our church, at least the Unitarian side of it. But our focus this morning will be on the future of our faith. Oh, the places we have yet to go. Unitarian Universalism is a faith on the move. It is a living faith that is changing. Why must it change? Simply put, because the world is changing. And what good are we if we cannot serve the needs of our world, the world that we live in today? Many prominent thinkers and writers, more than I can list here, have for some time now suggested that America has moved into a post-Christian age. My response to this postulate has always been, have you ever been to Jacksonville? Maybe it's because I live in the South, the deep South at that. But I am not yet ready to call us a post-Christian America, at least not quite yet. I will, however, agree that we are now living in a post-fundamentalist Christian America. No doubt some of you are thinking, Phillip, have you been to Jacksonville? How long have you lived here? America was a fundamentalist Christian nation for a long time, but I argue not anymore. Christian fundamentalism lost. And when I say Christian fundamentalism, I'm referring to that small and diminishing group of people who read every element of the Bible as literal and historical fact. Now, are we still dealing with some of the vestigial structures of institutionalized religious fundamentalism in this country? Yes, absolutely. Are there still pockets of active Christian fundamentalists in this country? Of course. But I would argue that these remaining fundamentalists are much like Hiro Onoda. Now that name may be familiar to some of you. Hiru Onoda was the Japanese World War II soldier stationed in the Philippines who refused to believe that Japan lost the war in 1945. He continued to carry out guerrilla attacks against Filipinos until 1974. Sometimes old soldiers have a hard time accepting the fact that the war is over. As a movement, as an ideology, as a worldview, American Christian fundamentalism lost. Why is this important to the future of Unitarian Universalism? Because for most of our history as Unitarians and as Universalists, we have primarily defined ourselves by what we are not. We have primarily defined ourselves by talking about what we stand against. In sociological terms, this is called oppositional identity formation. It's a phenomenon that is often associated with racial and ethnic minorities who resist assimilation into larger majority cultures. And indeed, throughout history, both Unitarians and Universalists have always represented a religious minority. And our defining characteristics have always been viewed as a heretical response to the established Orthodox majority. Unitarian Christians opposed the belief that most Christians had that God was a Trinity. Rather, they believed that God was one, a unity. Universalist Christians opposed the belief held by most Christians that unbelievers would burn in hell for eternity. Rather, they believed in the universal salvation of all. The very names, Unitarian and Universalist, derive from the oppositional stance that those religious folks took against the Orthodox majority. Unitarian Universalists for decades have oppositionally defined themselves as the alternative to religious fundamentalism in this country, which helps to explain the culture that has developed in many UU churches for the past several decades. That oppositional identity actually served us fairly well back when religious fundamentalism was part of the majority culture. But what happens when that idea that you oppositionally identify yourself against itself dies? When your definition of yourself is inextricably intertwined to the definition of something else that dies, then you die too. Allow me to give perhaps a physical, visible example of this. Chris, I've asked Chris to help me out here. Chris is going to stand nice and tall here for us. I'm going to stand against him in an oppositional stance. Get an eye here, let's pull back and, there we go. All right. I'm going to right here. We all got a good picture of that? Yeah. Let's go. I was taking a stance opposed and against Chris. We didn't actually act it out here, but imagine what would have happened if Chris would have fallen over backwards. What would have happened to me? I too would have fallen. The paradox is, when you stand against something else, paradoxically, you end up requiring it for your own support. And so, again, I will say that when your definition of yourself is inextricably intertwined to the definition of something else that dies, you die too. For decades, our Unitarian Universalist pews were filled and are filled with refugees of conservative Christian churches. Some 80 to 90% of all UUs are converts from some other religion, mostly Christian. That will cease to be the case in the future as fundamentalist Christianity begins to go extinct. So my question is, who will be the new UUs of the 21st century? My theory is that UU churches in the 21st century, in America at least, will not primarily be filled with the refugees of conservative religions. Rather, they will be filled with the refugees of the worldview or ideology that is replacing Christianity. In the future, our pews will be filled with the refugees of secularism. Secularism is an interesting word. It's an even more interesting concept. The word itself is derived from a Latin term that means worldly or temporal, thus putting it at odds with concepts that are otherworldly or eternal. American culture has been going through and continues to go through the process of secularization, or a moving away from a culture once defined by religion and religious values. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Personally, I would suggest that secularization is neither good or bad. Perhaps More specifically, it's both good and bad. My own ambivalence to the concept of secularization stems from my own ambivalent attitude towards religion more generally. Religion at its best can have a beautiful function. It is the process of living an examined and purposeful life, one in which we are not afraid to ask ourselves the big questions. It's an appreciation of, the standing in awe of, the majesty and the mystery and the wonder of this universe. I believe religion at its best is the foundation of beloved community. But as wonderful as religion can be, it of course has a dark and shadow side. Religion can also be a breeding ground for closed-mindedness, discrimination against outsiders, hatred of the other. It can create hostility to reason, rationality, and science. It can denigrate the value of human life and this physical world. It can inspire inertia, steeped in a belief in divine determinism, instead of spurring good people to take affirmative steps towards creating justice in their own time. Insofar as secularization moves us away from the dark shadow side of religion, I'm quite pleased with it, as I'm sure many of you are as well. But secularization can also represent the move away from the positive side of religion. Thus, the dark shadow side of secularism, especially in this country, leads to its own unique catalog of vices. The vices of the American secular age include, but are not limited to, selfishness, shallowness, materialism, self-indulgence, consumerism, commercialism, excess, affluenza, which is defined as the bloated, sluggish, unfulfilled feeling that results in efforts to keep up with the Joneses. Superficiality, a need for instant gratification, alienation. What is the end result of a life that dwells too long mired in the dark shadows of secularism? I believe this reality was glimpsed by pseudo-Unitarian Henry David Thoreau, who wrote in Walden, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." Thoreau, of course, was not speaking in reference to secularism, at least not directly, but he was speaking about what he perceived to be the end result of a kind of lifestyle that stripped men and women of their humanity. And I would argue that this loss of the fullness of our own humanity is precisely what the dark side of secularization can lead to. And it is the realization of this loss of our full humanity that leads to the quiet desperation that Thoreau speaks of. It is the desperation of a soul that knows it is dying. My soul began dying in law school. Now, I'm not saying that lawyers are less than human. There are, in fact, several amazing lawyers out there who live their values through their practice and make the world a better place and who live deeply fulfilling lives. But I also know that lawyers have some of the highest rates of depression and suicide among all professions. Trust me, I know why. 80 hours a week devoted to moving papers from place to place in the pursuit of money can do that to you. I experienced some of that desperation. My soul, I realized, was dying because it was starving. Like many other casualties of secularism, I had mistakenly believed that I could feed the soul with food designed for the body. But the soul, which is a ravenous little bugger, cannot recognize or digest food designed for the body. And people have been making that mistake perhaps since the beginning of recorded human history. You can't satisfy the soul with things like money, or physical possessions, or sex, or alcohol. I'm beginning to sound like a Baptist preacher, aren't I? Here's where I'll diverge from the Baptists. It's not that any of these things are wrong or sinful. It's simply a matter of understanding what they can and can't do. These things satisfy certain appetites of the body, and there's nothing wrong with that. As UUs, we do not believe the body or this world is evil. Money? Money's great. Are you kidding? Have you seen the cool stuff you can buy with money? Go get some money. You can buy a house that puts a roof over your head. You can buy a car, get you from point A to point B. Get money. If you get too much of it, you can always give it away, all right? I'll take it if you got too much. Don't worry about it. You know, sex, really good, right? All right, 2 thumbs up. I give it 5 stars. Responsible sex among consenting adults, absolutely, go for it. Not right now. After service would be preferable. I think I just heard Jonathan Edwards rolling over again. There's nothing wrong with sating the desires of the body, but that which sates the body will not sate the soul. And it's easy to forget that in a secular age. Michael Durrell, author and UU Church consultant, argues that Unitarian Universalism is a third way that stands as an alternative to both religious fundamentalism and secularism. And I agree. I would argue that for UUism to thrive in the coming decades, we must become a church that explicitly meets the needs of refugees fleeing the dark side of secularism. This means for Unitarian Universalism to grow in this increasingly secular world, we must feed the soul. We must become a sanctuary where we all may feed each other. The greatest soul food, of course, is love. When love truly becomes the doctrine of this church, and I'm not referring to this congregation necessarily, I'm talking about our greater faith of Unitarian Universalism. When love truly becomes the doctrine of this faith, when it becomes the ruling principle of our individual lives, when the spirit of love is palpable to every individual who walks through our sanctuary doors every Sunday morning, then we will have laid the necessary foundation to see explosive growth in our churches. I would argue that all of our worship, all of our sermons, all of our religious education classes, all of our weekly church programming, all of our service projects, all of our coffee hours should share the same ultimate goal. They should all teach or inspire us to love more and better. Because more than anything, that is what the secular world needs. It's what we all need. As we close our worship this morning, I exhort each of you, drink deeply of the love that is here in this sacred space. Right here, right now, we are surrounded by love. It's in the air. Breathe it into your lungs. It is here for the taking. Let it fill your soul. And then when we dismiss in a moment and walk out those doors, give it all away to whomever needs it. Don't be afraid that it will run out, because you always know where you can go to get more. Blessed be.